here, and I'm going to take sips from it occasionally. What a great turnout. Thank you so much for coming along. This is wonderful. So yes, I've never been asked to tell the story about how I came to this country. And everything that I want to say, I've timed it. It takes 9 hours, 37 minutes. So I'm going to have to leave certain things out. And if I am faced by the question, do I leave out the facts or do I leave out the jokes? I always leave out the facts, so we'll leave the jokes in. So the story of how I came here is actually a story of true love. And I will tell that story afterwards to anybody who's interested. But I want to start out by telling you a different origin story, which is the story about how I got involved in all of this. That story, by the way, is told with great flourish and more jokes in my book, which is here, which I'm going to attempt to persuade you to buy in droves. But it started like this. So most of my adult life, I have been a writer. Also a teacher of writing, a soccer coach, a guitarist, as some of you know, who were here for my talk on the guitar. In the Christmas of 2008, Christmas was approaching. As usual, I had absolutely no money. You know, if you're a freelance writer, you're trying to support your family, this is the state of being. But I grew up in England, very poor, and so at Christmas time we always made Christmas presents for each other. And so I thought I would make Christmas presents. And my then wife, who was a therapist, said, could you make me a sign for my office? And by a sign, she really meant sort of a shingle, something that hangs outside. It has the name, it has the little qualification letters afterwards. And my mother was an artist, and both my daughters are artists. I figured that the gene had skipped a generation. But you know, my mother always taught us you can do anything if you get a book out of the library. This is why this talk is very popular at libraries, by the way. So I had just finished writing my guitar book on the history of the guitar in America, and I had been watching this guy make me a guitar, and I thought, I would love to actually make something in wood. So I went to Sterling Hardwoods on Pine Street in Burlington, and they happened to have a piece of wood, curly maple. It was about 6 feet long, and it was what they call live edge. In other words, you know, it has the bark down both sides. And so they cut me a piece off the end. This is how cheap I was pitching all of this. And I printed my wife's name out and went into Kinko's and blew it up bigger and smaller until it pretty much fit the piece of wood. And then I went into Staples because I couldn't figure out how to get the writing on the wood. And I really did not have any faith in my skills whatsoever because I wasn't an artist and I wasn't a woodworker or anything. So I went into Staples and I said, there used to be this stuff called carbon paper. And they said, aisle 1, worst sale they ever made. I bought a packet of carbon paper. I'm still using that same packet of carbon paper. Anyhow, so I figured it all out. I did the carbon paper. I bought myself a set of hand gouges, and I've actually brought one of my pieces in progress, so you can have a look at how it all works. And there's one of the gouges is here, so you can see it. It's very sharp. Do not stick it into your body. Okay, that's the legal part of this talk. Over. And so I started carving this thing for my wife. And my older daughter, who was a senior at the Rhode Island School of Design, saw this and she said, oh, can you make me a sign as well? Because they had their senior show coming up. And RISD is a great school. They actually make the students try and sell their work. unlike other art schools. And so she said, you know, I have a table, but I want my table to stand out. Can you make a sign that says, designed by Zoe? So when my wife wasn't around, I would be working on hers, and then when Zoe wasn't around, I'd be working on Zoe's, and then my younger daughter, who at the time was a sophomore in high school and had no need of a sign whatsoever, said, oh, I want a sign as well. It has to say, Maddie Brooks, Fine and Performing Arts. You know, good luck putting that up as a shingle and having people, you know, drop in traffic. Anyway, as I was working on these, I realized that every relative that I needed to make a Christmas present for had some reason to need a sign, whether they knew it or not. And that was my apprenticeship. I spent the months before Christmas, you know, carving and trying to figure out what to do with all the little curly bits of wood that I had carved, and doing a terrible job of putting finish on. I actually saw one of those first carvings this past summer. And I said, can I please take that back and redo it? And my sister said, no, I like it. Anyway, that was the Christmas presents, and that was really my apprenticeship in wood carving. And after Christmas, so part of this talk is how genius works. You know, everyone's always interested in the workings of genius. So this is how genius works. After Christmas, I had really enjoyed this carving business. And so I was sort of at a loss. You know, I don't have anything else to carve. And as it happened, we had a hole in our living room wall. Now, it was not like, you know, the result of domestic violence or gang warfare. It was the fact that I had actually made a kind of a niche for a sound system that would kind of recess into the wall. And, you know, sort of a Star Trek thing that you would like wave at it as you went by and it would start playing, you know, very futuristic. And it all worked, and, you know, I cut into the wall and I put the sheetrock. But when we put the sound system in, it was awful. It was a terrible sound system, so I took it back out again, so we were left with this kind of niche in the wall. And by chance, this is how genius works, the niche was taller than it was wide. And I thought, I can't carve anything in English to go in there, or else everybody walking into the room would like kind of turn. And I thought, Chinese. Chinese is a vertical script. And so I looked up the Chinese characters for House of Music and Art. And I carved them, and with a certain amount of sanding and swearing, I got it to fit into this niche. And so it was like right there. And this was one of the things that I learned in carving these Chinese characters. Because Chinese is a genuine script, in other words, it is written as opposed to being printed. It is much more forgiving and much more expressive. So when I had been carving in the Latin alphabet, which is the one that we use, it really is predicated on mathematics. You've got to have parallel lines. You've got to have stuff that's symmetrical. You've got to have right angles. And if you make one mistake, everything is thrown off. Because if right in the middle of everything you do an L, and you make a mistake, and so you kind of make it L a little bit fatter because you kind of gouged it wrong, then all of a sudden it stands out because that letter is bigger than all the other letters, so you have to go redo all. Anyway, so that was the first time I began thinking about the design of writing. And obviously as a writer all of my life, I've been using writing, but the fact is, it's kind of like fish and water or us and air. The fact that we use it all the time doesn't mean we think about it. So I really started getting into these Chinese characters. And I kept on going back to Sterling Hardwoods and buying a bit more of this piece of wood. Luckily, they were very kind. But the pieces of wood that I was able to get off this initial piece were getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And also, everybody I knew by then, I had said to them, please choose a Chinese character that you think represents yourself. And I would carve it for them in something wooden. And so by the end, literally the last one was about this big. plus I had run out of people to give Chinese characters to. This is how genius works. Anyway, so I thought, maybe I'll try a different alphabet. And I had been in southern India on assignment for National Geographic in 2002. And I had seen that in the state of Kerala, which is right down in the southwest, they speak a language called Malayalam. And their script, when I was there and I was looking at it, it looked to my eye like a series of elaborately bent paper clips. It was just like, this is really strange. And I thought, maybe I'll carve something in Malayalam. And so, this is how the world works. I just Googled the word Malayalam, and it took me to this website called omniglots.com, which has all of the world's writing systems, or all the world's writing systems they knew about at that point. This is now 2009. So I'm flipping through this, and I was totally blown away. So there's this A to Z index. I'm sorry, I need to translate that, don't I? There was this A to Z index. I'm going through all of these scripts, and many of them are extraordinarily beautiful. And many of them are so strange you can't believe they're actually writing, at least so strange to our eyes. Obviously, to their eyes, it's quite normal. The other thing that I realized as I was going through these is that time and time again, in the text about each of these scripts, it said, no longer used for official purposes, no longer taught in schools, only used by priests, barely used at all, only used by women to write secret love letters. Exactly. And I thought, this is amazing, and I did some quick math, and I figured out that the world, even though the world has 6,000 or 7,000 languages, it only has a little more than 100 writing systems or scripts. And by my calculation, a third of them were in danger of extinction. And what that means is, and this is why this stuff is important, writing is the way we capture what we think matters most. Whether it's legal documents or histories or sacred documents or poems or personal correspondence or recipes, the things we write down are the things that matter to us. And if a given culture stops using its own traditional alphabet, which it may have been using for hundreds or even in some cases thousands of years, then the accumulated wisdom of that culture is lost. And they become, in essence, a suburb of some other culture. More likely, they become a persecuted or marginalized minority who are despised because they don't speak the main language well, or they have a different set of beliefs or whatever. And I started realizing this is going on all over the world. We look at the world map and every country has a different color. This is nonsense. Every country has multiple cultures, typically one of which is privileged and the rest are less privileged or not privileged at all. And so I thought, I'm going to carve some of these scripts. And the example that was on the pages in Omniglot for, this is what this script looks like, when you write something in it, was Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was compiled at the beginning of the founding of the United Nations. And it says, remember, this is Article 1, all peoples were created alike in dignity and respect. The second sentence goes, they were endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And I thought, that's a really noble sentiment, but many of these peoples, their writing, their languages are endangered precisely because people don't behave toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So I thought this was kind of noble and ironic at the same time. And so I decided that I would start carving that two-sentence text in a number of endangered alphabets. And this was by far the most ambitious carving thing that I'd ever done, and I thought there's every chance I will give up. Again, don't forget this is a talk on how genius works. And I thought, so what can I do to prevent myself from giving up halfway through? And so I arranged an exhibition of work by faculty and students at Champlain College. And at the time, we were renting space in a building in Winooski. And I said, we're going to go in here, we'll do all this. And what I do is going to be the centerpiece of this. So if I don't finish it, I will let everybody else down. So therefore, I had to finish it. And I had no idea how many of these I would be able to do. I thought I might be able to do 8. And in the end, I did 14. We also had problems where we at a crucial point, Sterling Hardwoods ran out of curly maple with live edge, and the guy who had, so this is a great Vermont story, the guy who had sold them that wood was lived like way the heck up in Newport, and so they called him and said, do you have any more of that live edge curly maple? And he says, yep. And they said, you know, we have a buyer for it, could you bring it down here? And he says, yep. And they said, when can you bring it down here? He says, spring. Because it was under like 4 feet of snow. Anyhow, we made our way through. So that exhibition happened, and two things, there were two reactions that I got from people that I had not expected at all. Because bear in mind, I had never been a visual artist before. One reaction was that people are saying, this is really, really important. And do you know, nobody else in the world is paying attention to this. And that was really a game changer, because I thought this was like one of those hobbies that people take up as they grow old, you know, where you go out in the garage and you discover they're making a scale model of Notre Dame Cathedral with matchsticks, you know, it's like, okay, right? But they're saying, no, this is really important work and you should keep doing it. And the other thing people said, which really surprised me, was, this is art. And I had really thought of it more as being documentation. And so the way my work changed after that is that I started thinking more and more in terms of not only documenting, but also looking at these scripts, the individual letters, their shapes themselves, and asking questions about them. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hold up a number of these carvings. I've done maybe 120 at this point, so this is just a selection. And talk about them, and then I'm going to pass them out. So the great thing about these is that they're very robust. You're not going to do much damage to them. You know, like you don't get many oil painters saying, okay, so this is my work, so pass it around. You know. On the other hand, if you drop it on your foot, it will hurt your foot more than your foot will hurt it. Some of them also have picture wire on the back, which if you stick your finger in the end of it, will kind of make a hole in your finger. So handle them carefully, not for their sake, but for your sake. So I'm going to go through these, and then I'm going to tell you about the project I'm working on right now, for which I'm going to try and enlist your support. And I'm probably going to be really in danger of going over time. So when we have 15 minutes left, I would like you all to start throwing small but you know, kind of aerodynamic objects at me so I know that. Okay. Of the selection that I have here, the only one that was actually in that original exhibition is this one. And I brought it along because what began to happen as I was carving these pieces is that when you carve something, you move slowly. And when you move slowly, you think about what you're doing, and questions occur to you, and thoughts occur to you. And because, as a journalist, you know, my first instinct is to do a certain amount of research, I actually began asking questions. So this is Cherokee. Now, Cherokee was the first and still remains pretty much the only Native American language to have its own complete writing system. And that happened, and I could tell this story for the next 20 minutes as well, because of one really remarkable man named Sequoyah. So, photo op. So, Native American peoples, by and large, really mistrusted writing. They saw it as a form of witchcraft. So it wasn't that they couldn't do it, or they didn't know how to do it. It was they wanted nothing to do with it whatsoever. Starting around maybe 1800, maybe a couple of years later, Sequoyah, who was a Cherokee who had been born in Cherokee lands in Tennessee but had moved out to Arkansas, began creating a writing system for his people, which was an extraordinary act when you think about it, because he himself was what you would call illiterate or non-literate. And he had to try and understand how an entirely different culture was using writing and overcome the sense that it was witchcraft at the same time. So he spent 10 years developing what is called a syllabary. So many languages are heavily syllabic, or as we would tend to say, musical. They go consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel. And what that means is that it's sort of natural to come up with a symbol that stands for a consonant and the vowel that follows it. It means you have more symbols. You can wind up with as many as, say, 70 or 80, but it works. And so Sequoyah came up with this syllabary, and he taught it to his daughter, whose name was Ioka, which was just as well, as it turns out. So he went to the tribal council. This is around 1820 now, and showed them, and they immediately put him on trial for witchcraft. But they did two things that were really smart, and again, unbelievably intellectually adventurous. They said, we think this is witchcraft, but we're prepared to have you prove us wrong. Okay, what government does that? And two, they came up with a test. So they separated Sequoyah and Ioka, and they gave each of them dictation. And they said, if what you say is true, then what you have written, when we give it to your father, he can then read it back to us. I mean, that is pretty astonishing. And it worked, and the tribal council did something else that most governments never do, which is they said, right, we are going to A, change our entire system of beliefs about writing, and B, radically overhaul our education. And they said, all of our young men and boys will now learn this, and subsequently women and girls. And the Cherokee Nation achieved literacy more rapidly than any other people in history. In places, they had a 90% literacy rate, which was a heck of a lot more than the whites who were living around there. Unfortunately, and Sequoyah's achievement was recognized by the US government, which awarded him a medal and I think £4,000, although he was, of course, never given the money, and a missionary, the Reverend Samuel Worcester, and his assistant, who was Sequoyah's brother-in-law, I think, set up a printing press, and they created a font-based form. So Sequoyah's form was very cursive, it was very curly. And the Reverend Worcester created this, which, as you can see, actually looks remarkably like the Latin alphabet, which is actually very confusing, because this looks like a D, but it's not pronounced D at all. And that looks like an H, but it's not pronounced like an H at all. Anyway, the Reverend Worcester melted down lead from the linings of tea chests and cast type and printed Bibles and prayer books and a newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix, which at one point had a circulation of 3,000. This is in the 1820s. It was read as far away as London. And the Reverend Worcester's goal with this newspaper was to demonstrate that the Cherokee, and by extension all Indigenous Americans, were actually perfectly capable of being literate and educated. And so it was really a transforming message that they sent out. Yeah?
By literate, you mean not just understanding language, but being able to write and read it?
Precisely. Precisely. Because, of course, most people regarded Native Americans as savages and uneducable. So there was a strong body of opinion that kind of went, wow. There was also a strong body of opinion that said pretty much exactly the opposite. And almost immediately, the Indian Removal Act was passed, which basically allowed the government to move Native Americans from their traditional lands elsewhere, typically further west. The Cherokee were not the first to be removed. They were the first to be put in concentration camps. The world's first concentration camps were invented to pen them in before they were then driven along what became known as the Trail of Tears and ended up in Oklahoma. So, needless to say, the Cherokee written language really kind of was almost destroyed by this, because the Georgia National Guard went to the printing press and took over the printing press. They stole the machinery. And they took the type and they dug it into the ground so it couldn't be reused. And so Cherokee was not printed for another 150 years at that point. But it did mean that when the Cherokee started to revive their own pride and sense of their own culture, they still had those Bibles and those prayer books that had been printed in Cherokee, and those became their kind of template documents. I want to say one other thing about Cherokee, which is kind of a really interesting indication of how this whole business of endangered alphabets works. So I carved this, taking the text from the Cherokee Nation website. I went out to Tahlequah, Oklahoma, where the Cherokee Nation headquarters are based. And I went into the Cherokee Heritage Center and showed it to them. And they said, oh, that's nice. And I realized they couldn't read it, because so few Cherokee, very few Cherokees speak Cherokee anymore, but a much smaller percentage can actually read and write Cherokee. So eventually I found an artist. So the Cherokee syllabary is so much part of their cultural heritage that there are a number of artists who will do paintings or fabric work, or all kinds of art, which incorporate not only, for example, a feature of a landscape or an eagle or something like that, but a letter from the syllabary. That's how closely identified they are with it. And so I showed this to her, and she's kind of working her way through it. And she gets here, and she says, I don't know that letter. And of course, because I don't read or write Cherokee and I'm just copying stuff, I'm sort of going, I don't know what to say. And she said, I don't know that letter either. Anyhow, subsequently, I went to the Cherokee Nation headquarters and sat down with their translators. They have two for the whole Cherokee Nation. And what I realized was that I had made a mistake. that on the Cherokee Nation website, the image of this text was kind of low res, and when I blew it up, it had pixelated. And this, which is down there, should actually be joined up here, and this shouldn't have 2 lines to it. But instead of saying, you got it wrong, she said, I don't know that letter, which is a sign of how, unless you have a breadth of standardization, then an endangered alphabet can sort of exist, but actually be so idiosyncratic, it's not much use. So let's say, for example, you're one village and you're another village, and there's one person in this village, we'll say it's you, who still knows how to read and write your traditional script. Let's say this is one of the islands in Indonesia. And then there's one person in this village, we'll say it's you, who still knows how to read and write this script. The fact is, you're going to do it differently. Because everybody writes a little differently. And so if I'm an anthropologist and I go in and I say, so how do you write? You say, this is how we do it. And you say, no it isn't, this is how we do it, right? So it means that apart from anything else, an endangered alphabet actually becomes a kind of code. But it also means that it has kind of broken free of an alphabet as we understand it, which is organized, systematized, and universally agreed on. And it's just a bunch of letters like alphabet soup. And I realized that always rings when anyone says alphabet. I won't say the other word, it'll ring again. And I realized that the Cherokee language, which is now really undergoing a revival, it would never be fully revived until the new Cherokee Phoenix, so that the Cherokee Phoenix is now being printed again in English and Cherokee, until someone writes to the editor and points out a typo. That will be the sign that the script has in fact been revived. Okay, so that's the only one I have here from that original exhibition. I also had this script in the original exhibition, although this isn't the same carving. So this is, if anybody here is Canadian, you may have seen this. So this is this is a wonderful story that's also in the book, a wonderful story and a tragic story. In the early 19th century, a missionary named James Evans, who may have learned shorthand in the grocery trade in England, came to Canada and lived with the Cree and the Ojibwe and created a syllabary for them. And it's really, what struck me as being really interesting was how mathematical this is. You know, you normally expect that over the course of centuries, letters are kind of are going to be like stones in a stream. You know, they're going to be smoothed out by continual use. This was actually the script that got me asking these questions. What was it? How could they have a writing system that was so precise and mathematical? It's also really interesting because let's take this character here. As this is also a syllabary, this shape indicates a consonant, but then if it's turned through 90 degrees, it implies a different vowel. So if it's this way up, it might be ta, and if it's this way up, it will be ti, and if it was this way up, it might be to, and if it was this way up, it might be tu. And I thought, that is such an extraordinary and kind of conscious notion. This cannot be an alphabet that has been around for 1,000 years, because otherwise it would have changed by now, it would have moved. And that was when I really first started researching these things that I was carving. And I discovered that this system here, which is now called Canadian Aboriginal Syllabics, is actually used not only for Inuktitut, the Inuit language, which is what this is. This is words in Inuktitut. It's also used for Cree and Ojibwe, Anishinaabe. a variety of scripts. And there are, bless the Canadians, there are areas, especially in northern Canada, where there's a high Inuit population, where the stop signs say stop in English, and underneath they say stop in Inuktitut. And that's when you start going, oh yeah, signage is one way that the official way of thinking reinforces itself. Because the dominant culture is going to say, oh, we can't possibly put all of our languages on a stop sign, which seems to make sense, until somebody from, say, an indigenous culture says, okay, so at the moment, we're not seeing our language anywhere. Anywhere. And then you have to start having those conversations. And so Canada is in the process right now of granting official status to multiple languages apart from just English and French. And if they do so, they will be the second nation in the world to do so. And I'm actually going to boast a little bit right now. The first nation in the world to do so is the Philippines. So when I started on this project, one of the scripts that I carved in this original exhibition was what's called Babayan, which is a script from the Philippines that predates the Spanish arrival. And it was incised in bamboo, and it's a really interesting looking script. And after that first exhibition went up, a friend of mine who's a videographer had me walk around from carving to carving and tell the story of each one, which is sort of what I'm doing here, only he gave me more time. And anyway, so I did this, and the video was posted on YouTube, and, you know, people looked at it a little bit, etc. Anyway, fast forward 8 years to about 3 months ago, where I discovered that the Philippines had passed this act to protect, preserve, and promote their own indigenous writing systems. And a little while later, I was on Facebook, which is how I do most of my research, with somebody from the Philippines, and I said, by the way, you know, you guys are really showing the world the way ahead. And he said, when we made our case to the Philippine Congress about this particular bill, which became an act, he said, one of the pieces of documentation we used was your video. And I'm going, who knew? I had no idea that was going on. Anyhow, so that's that. Next one I'll show you is this one. This is a script that was invented by the Greek Orthodox missionaries for writing the Slavic languages of the Balkans and Eastern Europe. It's called Glagolitic, based on the Croatian word glagolica, which means writing. And this, there are several fascinating features of this. One is that I have created a board game, the first Endangered Alphabets board game, which is now available to supporters of my current Kickstarter campaign, which I'll tell you about later. It's called Glagolitic Abbey. It's set in Bulgaria in the year 1200, and it involves monks and murder and stuff like that. And to play the game, you have to learn the Glagolitic alphabet. Anyhow, there's stuff that helps you. But the other thing that I find fascinating about this script is that this script came as close to extinction as you could imagine, and was saved by the most bizarre method anyway. So, as I say, this was one of the two scripts used by the Greek Orthodox Church. The other was named after Saint Cyril, and was, of course, Cyrillic. And ironically then went on to become the writing system for the godless Soviet Union, you know. Anyway, because Cyrillic was easier to write and less ornate and more adaptable, over the centuries, Cyrillic became the preferred script of choice. Until eventually, by the 1970s, there were only 2 priests left who were still writing in Glagolica. And they were on the island of Krk in the Dalmatian Sea, off the coast of Croatia, or at the time, Yugoslavia. And they were so conservative that, other people who were conservative in the church were kind of like, we should still do the Mass in Latin. And they were kind of going, no, we're not going to have any of this modern Latin nonsense. We're going to do everything in Glagolitic, right? In this language called Old Church Slavonic. Anyway, so they were still writing in Glagolitic, and when a fisherman bought himself a new boat, the name of the boat would be written on the side of the boat in Glagolitic, because then, of course, God will be watching over it and wouldn't sink. Anyhow, so we get to the 1980s, and the last 2 priests die. And so you would think, that's it. It's just not going to get used anymore. And it got saved by this bizarre thing, because the other person who died was General Tito. And so Tito was the military leader who had essentially been holding Yugoslavia together, which was sort of a cobbled together group of cultures, some of which had good reason historically to hate each other, etc. So again, you look at a country, it's all one color, don't believe it. And so, as you know, what happened at the beginning of the 1990s was the Yugoslav Civil War. And there's all of this bloodshed, it's horrible. And when the dust settles, you have all of these new nation states, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, etc., etc. But some of them have a major economic problem, which is that their principal source of income is tourism. But nobody wants to go to a country whose former military leader is now on trial for crimes against humanity at the World Court in The Hague, right? It's just not good publicity. And so Croatia did something really smart. They started using Glagolitic in their tourist materials. And so what that implied was, forget about this recent nonsense. We have historical legitimacy. We've been here all this time. We are this nation with deep roots. And it didn't matter that people actually couldn't read the letters. Nevertheless, Glagolitic script began to reappear. And now, as I say, there's a board game, and there's somebody, also in Bulgaria, I think, who's invented a card game using the Glagolitic alphabet. So who knows where the Glagolitic script is going to go next?
About 11:45, Tim, did you want to know that?
No, I did not want to know that. Okay. I'm just going to talk very quickly from now on. And so this means that, it's being taped. You can just play it back slowly, and then you'll understand what I'm saying. Okay, so this is another great illustration. This is the letter E in the Cham script of Vietnam. So the Cham people used to have their own kingdom, Champa, very historically deep, rich, etc. They were defeated by the king of Vietnam in the middle of the 19th century. And then what they suffered is what any defeated people suffer. They are scattered, they're marginalized, there are little pockets of them throughout South Vietnam and Cambodia. Many of them fled to Malaysia, etc. But the thing that I love about this particular letter is that, I'm hitting the microphone with my piece of wood, is that the letter E, the capital letter E in the Latin alphabet, is a perfect example of a letter that you cannot write by hand, because nobody can actually write 3 perfectly parallel lines of equal length and then these perfect right angles. It's an alphabet that was created for the monuments of Roman emperors. And so therefore it's intended to be A, divine, ideal, beyond the powers of ordinary people, just kind of scrawling stuff, and B, it needs to embody the virtues of empire, hence the value of symmetry. right? All of those capital letters, almost all of them, they're symmetrical. They can stand on their own 2 feet. They embody the permanence of the empire. And this is totally different. I often do this thing where I get people to trace this in the air, and you look at people's hands, and you realize that's the hand of a dancer. You know, it's the values embedded in the letters are completely different. And there's no symmetry here whatsoever, no interest in any symmetry. And so as I'm doing this, I'm starting to realize that really what we assume writing is like and what it does and what it's all about is actually extremely limited, and other cultures show us how limited it is. So this, for example, is Balinese, and this is a character that we don't even have anything like in our writing. It means, I suppose it's a form of punctuation, really. It means the text that follows is a sacred text. And so it means read it with a certain kind of openness of heart and respect. And then at the end of the sacred text, there's a similar character, which means the sacred text is now finished. You know, go back to doing what you're doing before, kind of thing. And I thought, this is really interesting, because if you put on a piece of wood and put it on a door, it would imply you are entering a sacred space. Please take your shoes off. And again, other cultures think about this kind of stuff, and we've kind of lost that. This is not an alphabet at all. This is a form of writing from a couple of countries in West Africa, a Adinkra symbol system. So the Adinkra system is essentially stories or proverbs or sayings or pieces of information that have been boiled down to one symbol. So this symbol is called Sankofa. And originally, it was more pictographic. It was a picture of a bird whose head is looking one way, but whose feet are pointing the other direction. And what it meant was look back as you go forward. In other words, learn from the past as you head into the future. And over time, it became more Janus-like, I suppose, and more symmetrical. So now we've got two birds and 2 tails, etc. And unless I had told you this was a bird, then you probably wouldn't have got it. So it's become less pictographic and more ideographic. It's more like just a symbol with a certain meaning. Again, this is just an entirely different way of looking at writing and thinking about writing. And it starts to change our understanding of what writing is and what it can do. The last thing I want to do, seeing as I'm running out of time, is to talk about what I've been doing increasingly in the last 3 or 4 years. So, having been working on this stuff, sort of from a theoretical basis at a distance, I actually encountered somebody from a minority culture who was suffering exactly the kinds of issues that I've been talking about. He is from the Marma people, who are an indigenous ethnic group in Bangladesh. And the Bangladesh government refuses to allow indigenous peoples, of which there are at least 14 different groups, to be educated in their own language. In fact, it refuses to allow them certain basic human rights. And the area where he grew up is militarized as a way of segregating them from majority Bengali Muslim population. And as a result, some pretty terrible things happened to him while he was there and continue to happen. Burning of villages, rape and murder of young girls, all as a means of suppressing the identity of the indigenous people of the region. And so I started working with him. He was in the process of creating a mother language school where indigenous kids could learn in their own languages first and then proceed to learn the national language or global languages like English. And so I did some carvings for him. my students at Champlain and I created a whole variety of educational materials, colouring books, the first colouring books ever seen in the region, writing journals, children's storybooks, a dictionary, rubber stamp pads with letters on so that they can stamp their letters out and sort of have fun learning them that way. We had to ship them stamp pads as well, ink pads, because they didn't have any. This is, it's an impoverished region. All of that supported, by the way, by Kickstarter campaigns that I ran. And since then, I've been working with a number of individuals and groups around the world who are trying to revive their own culture, their own language, their own writing system. And I've been doing a number of things along those lines. So I talked about the Glagolitic Abbey game. I've also created a bunch of decks of playing cards that are alphabet playing cards. So that, and I invented a bunch of games that you can play, not using regular playing cards, but using the letters. And so those are in the process of being printed, and those have been shipped out. The Cree ones have already gone to the Cree. The Abenaki ones are in the hands of some of the Abenaki around here, so all of that's happening. And the thing that I wanted to leave you with is that right now I am running a fundraiser on Kickstarter to create the world's first online atlas of endangered alphabets. So what this will do is it will literally put these cultures on the map. Part of the issue is that people don't know that they exist, especially people in the privileged world don't know that they exist, or they don't know that this is an issue either. So it's going to look like Google Maps. There's a world map. You zoom in, the pins appear, you click on the pin. It identifies this particular culture, both in English and in its own script. You click on that and you get to a page which shows photographs of this script in use and of the people and the culture that use it, and then links to a variety of things that ideally will help in the revival process, like links to fonts, when people are starting to create fonts, for example, or keyboard software, or apps, or learning, online learning tools, or organizations that are dedicated to reviving that particular culture and all of its identity. So in Java, for example, which is part of Indonesia, there's a group of people who are doing amazing stuff, creating new Javanese fonts. So the Javanese script is an endangered script, but these people are really making art out of these beautiful elaborations of the Javanese letters, so people are then starting to use them. And so it's kind of going in that way. In Bali, also in Indonesia, they're using a different approach. They've created a wiki dictionary, so anybody who actually still knows Balinese words and Balinese script can contribute words to this interactive dictionary. And that has now, I think it's got 10,000 words in it and growing. My aim with this interactive atlas of endangered alphabets is to really give help to people all over the world who are trying to rediscover their identity and their dignity and their functionality as a people, rather than continuing to be a marginalized and, in some cases, as I've said, actively suppressed minority. With that in mind, two things. First of all, everybody here on your way out, you can pick up. So these are the cards that I was using as trials to create games using letters on playing cards. So I was sitting in muddy waters in Burlington, and people would come and say, "What are you doing?" And I would say, "Sit down," and we would try out all these different games. And the reason I'm going to put these over here so you can pick one as you go is because my website is on the other side. So now you all have, like, my business card. You can contact me through the website, and also if you go through to the first blog post on the website, or if you click on the video, you'll get all the links to the current Kickstarter campaign. So I'm going to put those over here, and you should absolutely feel free to take one. Those are free. I also have small amounts of Endangered Alphabets merchandise to sell. I have Endangered Alphabets greeting cards and a couple of mugs and some copies of my book. But before we get around to that, I will happily take your questions. Yes?
Can you tell us what the signs say?
This one here?
All of them.
Oh, okay. So as I say, this one here, the Cherokee one, that's Article 1 of the UDHR, which I told you about. This one here, oh, this is actually biblical. Beginning of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, which is an extraordinarily profound notion. And at some stage, I'll tell you my theory about the relationship between the evolution of speech and the evolution of the human species. So in the beginning really was the Word. This is words, that says the letter E. This, my work in progress, this is Tibetan calligraphy. And this says family harmony 3 times around in a circle. So it's like a mantra. Okay. Yes, other questions? Yes?
Is there any correlation between the characteristics of a culture that writes horizontally, left to right and right to left, or vertically left?
So that's exactly the kind of question that I was asking myself when I started out. Plus questions like, does your brain develop differently if you track left, right, left, vertically, etc.? And it turns out that the answers are really, really interesting, but they're not what you would think. So when we think of the direction of writing, we're used to thinking of writing as an act that's carried out under very controlled circumstances. We have a horizontal, level surface. We write on some kind of medium like paper on it, etc. For most of history, writing has not taken place under those favored circumstances. So the Berber people of North Africa typically write in the sand, or traditionally wrote in the sand, lying on their left elbow, and writing with their finger in the sand. And what that means is that if you try and write horizontally in lines, you can only write about 2 lines before your right elbow jams into your hip. And so they would write like away from themselves. And the vertical scripts of Eastern Asia, especially the Mongolian scripts, which I have here. You can come and see this afterwards. It turns out that is actually derived from a script called Devanagari, which sort of arose in the Indus Valley, northwest India. But in moving further east, somehow it just turned through 90 degrees. And even our own script derives from Phoenician. And when the Greeks copied the Phoenician script, they turned all the letters through 90 degrees. And so the Phoenician word, letter A, stood for Aleph, which, amongst other words, which meant ox. And so the A was like an oval with 2 horns. That's the head of the ox. When the Greeks took over the writing system, they turned it, for reasons that no one knows, through 90 degrees, and so it became alpha, which is like that. And then when they made the capital A, it got turned through 90 degrees again and became like this. So all of these transformations have happened because writing has been a great deal more volatile than we tend to think. You know, we tend to think of it as being very authoritative. That's a relatively new notion. I realize I've answered a slightly different question than one you asked. I hope, nevertheless, this has been interesting and entertaining. Other questions? Yes?
The Cherokee and the other cultures, they have their own symbols for numerical quantities?
Great question. So if there are endangered alphabets in the world, there are even more endangered number systems. So as globalization and global communication means you also have globalization of commerce, there's all the more reason to use universal numbering systems. And so there are quite a few cultures that actually did have their own number system. And I actually do have some carvings at home with some of those. But those are all falling into disuse because everybody is now using, you know, the standard Indian/Arabic/Latin one that we use. So I don't think, I can't remember if Sequoia came up with numerals as well or not. Yeah, I can't remember. Sorry. Yes?
So I just came back from the Andes, and they have no written language in the Incan Empire, and that sounds very similar to your story about the fact that it was witchcraft. But they did have some mechanism of communicating through a series of knots hung on a...
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, someone said to me, are you going to do the knotted string scripts? And I'm kind of going, it's all I can do to carve wood. Give me a break here. Yes, that's a really, and I've already forgotten what the name of that particular writing system is, but yes, it's really interesting. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Yes?
I hate to be the party pooper here, but do you see a possible movement toward a universal alphabet or language?
Great question. So the fact is that there already is, the internet is doing two opposite things simultaneously, which is one of the reasons why it's such an interesting phenomenon. On the one hand, it is homogenizing the world. And so, for example, if Facebook were a country, it would be the world's fourth most populous country. And to use Facebook only supports something like 17 different writing systems. So I have people all over the world who communicate with me through Facebook whose names I don't know because they just come out as a series of little null character squares, right? So in that sense, the internet really is ushering people towards a greater homogenization. On the other hand, I couldn't have done this without the internet because I'm now talking to people all over the world who are able to send me this stuff. And there's no doubt that by creating Facebook groups in particular, people who want to revive their own culture and document it and communicate with each other are much more able to do so. And so we have this globalization, homogenization, but especially in the last 5 years, everything has changed since I began this project in 29. Everything has changed. 29, the only people who were using the Babayan script in the Philippines were tattoo artists. Now it's officially protected by the Philippine government and it's on their currency. So, yeah, both things are happening at the same time. I'm always suspicious of anybody who says we ought to have a universal language because what they really mean is everybody should speak my language. And so I'm talking to Chakma people, you know, who are a minority, a very rich minority with a great history of all kinds of things in Bangladesh. And they're not saying, boy, wouldn't it be great if the world all spoke Chakma? Because they know what it's like to be on the outside. So with that, I will stop. Please come up and look at and ideally purchase some of these things. The greetings cards are $2 a piece. The mugs are $5 a piece. The carvings, some of them are for sale. Pick up a playing card on the way out. And please consider supporting my Kickstarter because this Atlas of Endangered Alphabets is the most ambitious thing I've ever done, and as a result I have to raise more money than I've ever done before. Anyway, thank you for your time and your intelligence.